In one of the videos that Laura Layla put up recently, hi there Laura Layla, your video, it was the one on the beach where you're dressed as a mermaid eating a chocolate rabbit, and in the comment section I made some reference to the void, because this rabbit is chocolate and I kind of identify with rabbits, and because chocolate rabbits are hollow, it just struck me that, oh yeah, those chocolate rabbits are hollow, aren't they? That means they've got an emptiness inside them as well as an emptiness outside of them, and they only exist as the kind of moulded interface between two voids. And I was kind of captured by that, and it reminded me of that previous video you had made of that painting you did called Gash, which is of a painting of a woman's torso with what appears to be a tear or a cut possibly in it, and what you see inside the cut is a darkness, a void, which is the same as the darkness around the outside of this painted torso. So again, there's a resonance there for me about being human, you know, what it feels like to be alive and awake, that experience of being a person, being it's possible to think about that as this thin foil between two impenetrable voids, between two darknesses, the inside an internal darkness and an external darkness. It's just a poetic image, but it seemed to me there was a similarity in those two images, and it got me thinking about that really. Partly because I guess it just resonates with other things I think about in terms of metaphors of size, metaphors of solidity, and how those metaphors, you know, which is a lot of the way we think, how those things are playing themselves out in our thinking. Because one of the things that I suspect we all do on some level, and I know I find myself doing, is kind of imagining. Oh God, I'm kind of a little bit confused here in my thinking, so I apologise if this is fumbly. But I kind of imagine these things as a kind of continuum. You know, when we set up continuums, all of us, you know, like hotter, and like the scale of hotness and coldness, or the scale of size, or the scale of height, or all those kind of scales of time. One of the things that I think happens with all of us there, and it's implicit in that cognitive capacity we have to arrange things in scale order, is that we imagine ultimate end points for those scales. I mean, if you just imagine the scale for time, you know, we look forward in time and we look back in time, and this time is divided up into years or months or weeks or hours or so on. But we also imagine ultimate endpoints for that, or we try to imagine ultimate endpoints for that, but it gets very fuzzy. You know, the end of time is, we can kind of imagine it as a phrase, but I'm not sure we can imagine it as a concept. It exists as a really nebulous concept. And similarly, the beginning of time, you know, we can kind of give it a name and call it creation or the Big Bang or something like that, but our imagination wants to go past that and see another kind of ultimate beginning, you know. And the same is true with all kinds of measurements, isn't it? And even when we know there are ultimates, there is an absolute zero in terms of temperature, for example. And I think it's recently just been possible to go below that kind of. But the idea of an ultimate low temperature is kind of inconceivable. We want to think of it as going further, because we can't imagine a line coming to an artificial endpoint, and those kind of things. Right. And the reason why I'm saying that is, for me, that image of what a being is, which is captured in the chocolate rabbit and in the Gash painting, this being which is a thin surface, a thin foil interface between two voids, is also a kind of poised within a continuum of size and distance that stretches out that void, the void that leads out into infinite blackness of that kind of space, conceptual space, and also the void that leads inwards to an infinite blackness and darkness of conceptual interior space. You know, and I think, well, I can certainly do this, but who knows? Just imagining oneself caught between those two voids, or created at the interface between two voids, I find very interesting. But as part of that, and just to return to this thing about ultimates, that also seems to be part of that. Certainly when I think about an interior space, that void of the interior space, the inside of that chocolate rabbit, or the blackness that's inside that gash in that body. You know, what lies at the end of that? I kind of imagine it as going obviously deeper and deeper inside, but also kind of smaller and smaller and more dense, until the ultimate end point, which isn't really an end point, but the ultimate end point is a kind of infinitely small, infinitely dense, dimensionless point. Contentless, dimensionless point, the still centre of the turning world, that kind of idea. But then again, when I project outwards, and I imagine the void that's outside the chocolate rabbit, outside the veil of flesh, I imagine that being larger and more evanescent, not more solid, more gaseous, more, I hate to use the word spiritual, but that kind of spiritual in the sense of like a gas is spiritual, more transparent, translucent, more vacuum-like, and more all-encompassing, you know. So it's more like it isn't like a small hard point, which is down here, but like a vastness, you know what I mean? And so where the beingness is caught, in spatial terms at least, between the small hard point and the huge vastness, and we're somewhere in the middle of that. But also not just in space, but also in time, kind of. I'm not sure if this makes any sense to you at all. This is just again another intuition thing. If I imagine that void being a kind of temporal void, then it's down to the smallest Planck constant of time, you know what I mean, the smallest syllable of recorded time, just held in that infinite fragment of smallness and hardness, whereas the journey outwards into the external void is also an opening out into time, so that the duration of that ultimate extension is eternity itself. You know, there's just eternity there, a totality of time, as opposed to the smallest currency of time. Make any kind of sense? Yeah. If I was going to have a God, I haven't got a God, but if I was going to have a God, there'd be the name I would give to the one out there. And if I was going to have a self, that would be what I would have in here. But there's no religious trappings associated with that, as I'm aware, but it's something like that. Oh, and that, of course, other than to say that the one that's out there is the same one that you'd have and everybody else and everything else. But again, that's just poetic imaginings.